I think the most important thing to remember, especially for young people coming into this going, I'm a little uncertain at this point, given the results of the election. Listen, all the people in my book started in the 80s and the 90s in this. They're still with us working in renewables. So that should be a good indicator to you that if you stick in it, you'll win in this, right? And we all will win, and we'll get through this.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm really excited to have on the podcast Tom Weirich. He's the head of marketing and stakeholder relations at North America for EDP Renewables. He also has an award-winning book called We Took the Risk, and you were actually named Solar Top 100 by KWH Analytics. Tom, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you here today. Thank you for making the time.
Well, definitely, Benoy. Thanks so much for having me, and excited to have this chat today.
Yes, and you're the original Solar Maverick. People like you, and it's amazing to hear that you started your career pretty much in solar, which is actually pretty rare back then when you talk about the early 2000s, but now is actually becoming pretty common. Can you tell everyone what you do for EDPR and your solar background? I think our audience would love a lot.
Not a problem. So right now I'm actually going into year 4 here at EDP Renewables North America. So based in Houston, Texas, and I have the privilege of overseeing a team working on everything from marketing to public relations to internal comms, external comms, you name it, media relations, and handling basically all the ins and outs of brand and communications here at EDP. And so we're the 4th largest owner and operator of renewable energy here in the US. We're also one of the top 4 owners and operators globally of renewables. And I really have the privilege, I would say, of being able to learn tons during the day. I work amongst all of our business units. So 1 hour working on solar, next hour working on wind, next hour working on storage. Then before I know it, I'm working on green hydrogen. So it's a great opportunity to be a chameleon, which I'm thankful for, and really working to expand our portfolio here in North America. How I got into renewables, oh gosh, that's a story and a half. So I started in renewables, and actually this month is my 20th anniversary of being in renewable energy. So it's a special month, December. But I started back in 2023, coming back to Washington, D.C., into an environment where renewables was just beginning. This was the early 2000s. Finance wasn't really spoken about Wall Street around renewables, right? Technology, the innovation was coming, but it wasn't yet there. And the policies obviously weren't yet created to help funnel financing and technological evolution, right? So all 3 of those kind of stars, if you want to call them those, weren't aligned. And it was a great opportunity to actually pull together that nascent initial industry, right? And finally give it a professional business value prop, right? And get it rolling. It was a matter of being at the right place at the right time. So came back after the second bubble burst in Silicon Valley, was freshly back in Washington, D.C. I'd previously gone to college for undergrad there at Georgetown. And so I remember bunking with a friend and trying to interview as much as I could after Thanksgiving of that year, and was bunking with a friend who actually was employee number 1, getting the American Council on Renewable Energy 8 course started up. Back then, it was a 2-person shop. It was really just a 1-person shop. Mike Eckhart, who was the founder, was still voluntarily working there. He wasn't salaried. And this young lady, Jody Russell, who I got to college with, was his first associate. Getting that organization set up, there was maybe $250,000 in the bank, all based on initial research on renewable energy in the US. And they were putting on the first ever policy dialogue on renewable energy on Capitol Hill in the Cannon Caucus Room. And I was sleeping on her floor and was about to head back to my parents, who had back then lived in New York, to get ready for Christmas break. And she said, hey, we're putting on this policy forum. We have all these big names sponsoring the event like GE and First Solar and a couple others. We don't know how to handle media. We don't know how to handle sponsors. Would you mind staying for a couple more days? Then I'm like, yeah, I'm sleeping on your floor. Of course, I'm happy to do this. And funny enough, little did I know that would be the beginning of my career and chapter 1, I would say, of my story in renewables. And so fast forward by 2 days, I volunteered. I really fell in love with the energy, the passion of the people, right? All the innovators. These were the initial days where the room was filled with 150 people, and that was the industry, right? And I just was amazed by the passion, the determination of these innovators. You had initial financiers like John Cavalier and others in there in the room, and you had some of the initial policymakers and congressmen who are pushing for renewables there. And I remember leaving energized and going, this is the industry for me. And the next day, I marched into Mike Eckhart's office in International Square, for those of you listening who know Washington, D.C. really well. And I said, hey, you have to hire me. And he said, well, we don't have the money. I'm like, well, let's figure it out. And lo and behold, that's the start of my career at Acor. And he gave me a 2-month assignment to start selling exhibit booths at the PowerGen Renewable Energy and Fuels event, which for those of you that go way back, that was an event Penwell used to run every year, a trade show on renewables. And short of it all, I exceeded quota. And the board at Acor said, hey, you have to keep this kid. And that started my 12 years at Acor. That then, in essence, started my career here in renewables.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. And actually, if you read the book, you go into a lot more detail about it. I actually learned a lot from reading. If you don't know the book that Tom wrote, it's called We Took the Risk, the stories behind the early risk takers in the U.S. renewable energy industry and the leadership traits that made them a success. It came out actually, I think in September of 2022.
22. Yeah, it just celebrated 2 years.
2 years. So congratulations on that. I actually learned a lot from listening to the book, and Tom's a great narrator. He's both the author and narrator of the book. And it was interesting for me to hear about your journey, and specifically with Acor, because my company, Reneu Energy, we're a member of Acor and then also part of the Accelerate program, the first graduating class, which is for minority and women-owned companies through the Acor program. And it was just interesting to me to learn about how the organization started, how it grew into what it is today. And obviously you were talking about Ref Wall Street, the Grid Forum, and really how it helped with a lot of the lobbying efforts in renewables in Washington, and that you were largely a part of. So I thank you for doing that work, which obviously was at the very beginning. And it was interesting to hear too about like President Bush after 9/11, the independence, how he was focused on renewables and the 1603 grant. Like I learned a lot of things, and you're the original Solar Mavericks, and we need people like you to trailblaze to where we are today. I think what would be great is if you could maybe talk about the book and what made you write the book.
Yeah.
Really interesting, because even 2 years after this book has been released, like I learned a lot from it, and I've been in the solar industry since 2007. So I can imagine a lot of our audience as well, who we call Mavericks, would learn a lot. And the special people and the special skills and leadership qualities that you need to be successful.
Yeah, and the book is all about Mavericks, right? I mean, this industry, and one of the takeaways in the book is, listen, we need that Maverick spirit to continue. It's essential for us to be entrepreneurial, to push the boundaries on what this industry could do, really, and really be aspirational in our aims. That's what gave us the foundations to get this industry going. But yeah, the book, quick and simple of it, the book was meant to be initially, the project that I was putting together was meant to be just an op-ed, 750 words that I was writing to thank a mentor of mine in renewables who started me in renewables, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Holmberg, who had passed away recently back then, and who in many ways was the godfather of the biofuels industry. And I had missed his funeral, and I felt this was my way of giving tribute to Bill. And so I started working on that project thinking, you know what, this will be an in and out one weekend pipe up that I can then pitch to Biofuels Magazine and do my honor to Bill that way. And what ended up happening was, while I was interviewing CEOs that were interns of his during his career, who are now CEOs of big biofuels companies, they all were coming to me with stories that I wish I had known as someone who was starting out renewables in my 20s. And just inspirational stories I had not known about the original beginnings of renewables in the US industry and the US industry in the initial days. And I was like, this is something that would be really helpful to have pulled together so that when I mentor or talk to an intern and want to inspire them, I can say, hey, here's something you can refer to get a full understanding of and appreciation of all the hardships the founders of the renewables industry had to go through. So I decided, okay, well, let me consider doing something more about this. Right when I was thinking about that, I got a phone call from one of my former professors at Georgetown University who had started up an institute, a writing institute for first-time authors, who had also set up a publishing house called New Degree Press. And he called me and said, hey, I feel like you have a story to write. I think you need to work with me and we need to publish a book. And I'm not a believer in fate, but I'm sorry. But when that happens, I felt like Bill Holmberg from above was saying, hey, you have a mission. And in true military fashion, I could hear him say, you have a mission, you need to complete it. And as a result, this book came out of that. What was supposed to be an op-ed turned into an 80,000 word book trying to recap 25 to 35 CEOs' journeys, and really also at the same time talk about leadership traits that help those initial founders of renewable energy get to where they were or who they are now today, but also to weave in the history and show these characters, as I would say, these CEOs, with the backdrop of this industry that has been a roller coaster ride based on policies, based on financing, based on just the history of the US and economics of the US, right? And show that really no path is linear, that these individuals had to choose their own way and also pave their own way. And that we all have the privilege of, I would say, working in their footsteps, right? And forging our own ways as we grow out this industry. So this book became that history book, plus that book on leadership, plus that inspirational book of mentors that we could all follow in advancing our own renewable energy careers.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because a lot of the people are still very actively involved in the renewable energy industry. Maybe half the people that you talked about, like I've had some sort of interaction or know them personally. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective or learn more about their story that I didn't even know about.
Well, and that was an important part of it, that this is living history still. And unfortunately, my experience with losing Bill Holmberg and not having the opportunity to go back to him and ask him all the questions I wish I could have asked him about the initial biofuels industry, we have the opportunity today to still talk to these founders and garner and glean as much advice as we can, not only on leadership, but also on how to not recreate the wheel, right? Garner that inspiration, right? To get us to the next phase of the renewable energy industry's evolution, right? So it's also a wake-up call that to take advantage of every relationship we have today, don't at all value those relationships and get as much as we can from those individuals who really have forged a way for all of us.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it was interesting, obviously, about you talking about investing in relationships and all the advice from different mentors that received. It's interesting because you talk about leadership traits to be successful in the solar industry. Can you go into more detail for our audience? And obviously, I recommend everyone to get the book and read it because I think it goes into great detail and it's very succinct and clear and gets to the point and interesting too. I love the story aspect of it as well, with taking different qualities and then basically talking about different founders within the industry.
Every book is a compilation of stories, right? That was the first thing I learned with my developmental editor. So when you first are brought on by the publishing house to write a book, you get a development editor, right? That teases out things as you're in almost like discovery phase of writing the book. And every book writing journey starts with stories, just compilations of stories, right? And what we thought would be really interesting, to your point, was to have the main chapters that reference these leaders, have them themed by traits that I felt were important in creating not a perfect, but a successful, impactful renewable energy professional, right? Or renewable energy leader. Now, it was funny is interviewing these CEOs, I didn't ask them point blank, hey, what's your superpower leadership trait, right? I let them talk about their stories. And funny enough, all of them self-identified that trait without me even asking. And so each chapter is basically themed and defined by that super trait or that leadership trait that I feel is vital in order to succeed in renewables. A few of my favorite ones are persistence. You have to be persistent. This is not an industry for the faint of heart. You have to be persistent. You have to know what you're going for, and you have to do it, right? And I think even more so for developers these days who are on the ground in those town hall meetings, you all know what I'm talking about. You have to be persistent and believe in the project and the impact that project will have for your local community, right? So persistence was one. Another one that I love that I feel special for those of us in the renewables industry is audacity. You have to be audacious. You have to think bigger. We have a big challenge in front of us. This energy grid of ours is outdated, it's antiquated, and you have to be audacious. You have to see beyond the realities of today to see the future of what can be and how it can positively transform the energy sector to be equitable, to give people access to energy no matter where they are, right? Through community solar, things like that. So audacity was another big one that I felt was important. And I would say those are my two favorite ones. The one that I ended with, which was the chapter dedicated to Bill Holmberg, was grit. You have to have grit. You have to be able to go through the ups and downs, go through the millions of no's in order to get to that one contract deal that's finally a yes, and be able to pull yourself by your bootstraps and say, okay, let's do it. And I felt out of all of them, that grit chapter was the last one, but it was the most impactful one that I think left you with this feeling of, okay, if I'm persistent, if I'm audacious, and if I have grit, I can make it through anything. So I'm not going to go through to any of them. There's a lot of those traits in there. And obviously I couldn't address all the traits, but it was a great journey because I wish, like I said before, I wish my mentors had something like this to hand me as an intern, right? Or as somebody starting in the industry and say, hey, here's a guidebook to how to really get started in the industry and have an appreciation of where we came from. And also, here's inspiration for you to pave the way forward for all of us, right? And I think that's the parting lesson is we all have the makings here to be a leader in renewables. And here are just many examples to show you the way.
Yeah, definitely. It was really inspirational. I think after I read that, it gave me more excitement about the industry and everything. And then reinforcing those qualities, right, that we all have within ourselves and just hear
Yeah.
these other leaders who have been successful. And it was really inspirational. I was curious, how long did it take for you to work with the publisher and write, then having a finished product? It seems like
Yeah.
it took a while.
Yeah, no, this was an expedited way. So it depends on which publisher you go with, right? So I went with, like I mentioned, New Degree Press, which is now called Manuscripts, and it's a community-based publishing house. And all in all, it took about a year and a half, which is fast for a book.
Now,
It's really fast. And that's including discovery, research, interviewing. I interviewed over 100 executives for this book. I couldn't put all of them in there, right? As a first-time author, you're usually restricted to about 80,000 words, just because the publisher doesn't want to take too much of a risk on you, no pun intended, but they don't want to take too much of a risk on you. They want to see what you're up to and how your book will do. So they restrict you to about 80,000 words max, and they work with you. And let me tell you, it's humbling because there were 8 people who worked with me during my journey at the publishing house. And every single editor gives you a gloss. And writing a book is 2 things. It's basically learning how to be very patient. It's all about revisions. I think I did about 30 cuts of the book. And it's like onion layers. Every editor works with you to add yet another onion layer. So you work on plot, you work on theme, you work on messaging. One thing for those of you who read the book, there's an analogy I keep on referring to in the book called the oak tree analogy, which is what I think the renewable energy industry is. This common meeting place that all of us with the same values and dreams can come to, right? To meet up, to recharge and get reinvigorated on our mission and continue forward. And for me, that oak tree analogy was important, but that was a revision. I had to go through the book and figure out how do I weave in this oak tree narrative throughout all the chapters, right? So with every revision was another onion layer. So it was definitely a lesson in patience. And that's what took a lot of time was the onion layer revisions. Obviously, I had many beta readers help me with reviewing the book, giving their feedback. And then you go through layout. Never did I know how important layout is to a book. Never in a million years did I ever think it was that important, but it really is. But yeah, it took about a year and a half. And I was really blessed to have over 681 people contribute in my pre-sales to the book. And as a result, in 2 years, it's been over 7,000 copies sold. You mentioned the audiobook. That was a separate 6-month adventure, about 54 hours of work into a final 8-hour book. And again, as someone who's in podcasting, Benoy, you know how it goes with editing. You go through the whole script. You can't read the book like a speech. You have to really have passion and energy as you read the book. Or as you narrate the book, rather, right? And yet you do the whole book in chapters. You send it to your editing team. They come back with a document highlighted, hey, we need you to redo these sections. Luckily, I only had I remember 52 sections I had to redo. And you just pray that you sound like the day you narrated the book and you go back to it. But it was a journey. And like I mentioned to you before, when you narrate the book, you learn a lot about your cadences. You learn about yourself, your crutch words, and it is an act of humility because you have to listen to yourself. You're forced to listen to yourself a lot, and it gives you a lot of self-awareness that I know in my case I did not have. So when I now speak to people, I'm much more self-aware of how I'm speaking, how long I'm speaking, right, and things like that. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think what comes through on the audiobook, I always like when the author actually reads the book because I could hear your passion for the topic and the topics within the book and your excitement.
It's one of those things. I remember when I did my first manuscript for the book, my development editor came back to me and said, hey, you're missing something in this. And I'm like, what? He's like, I don't hear your voice. You weren't a fly on a wall watching this all happen. You weren't a drone, overhead watching this all happen. You were there in these stories. You were seeing this happen. I need you to rewrite this with you in there. And I think that was one of the best lessons I ever got in my life was out of a sense of humility, or even we all suffer imposter syndrome. Every one of us does. And I felt like who would care what Tom Weirich was saying in these things. And that was a life lesson that people care. They really want to hear it from your eyes, from your voice, right? And so that was one of the revisions. I had to go through and rewrite the book from that perspective of me being there, interacting with all those characters, with me being there, experiencing it. And at the end of the day, is this book a perfect history of renewable energy in the US? No, heck no. But it's something through my eyes that I saw that hopefully personifies it and makes it personal enough so that anyone who reads it feels like we're having a coffee table chat, a breakfast chat, talking about renewables, and really can see themselves there with me, alongside me, walking through all these stories, right? And hopefully having them come alive a little bit. So,
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you obviously committing a lot of time to come up with the book. And it's a great resource, I think, for anyone in the renewable energy industry. Can you talk about maybe other things that I guess, what was interesting, I thought was, which I've heard this before, is always ask when you network with someone for them to introduce you to people that's not in your network. I know that was one of your mentors to you. And it's actually, I think you mentioned this several times in the book as well, which
100%.
is really smart.
I remember,
And sometimes I forget to do that, but it's really helpful.
100%. So that lesson or that advice was given to me by Mac Arcard. And it was actually my first day at Acor. Back then, we had no laptops, right? It was desktops. I was in a Harry Potter kind of closet, no windows, tons of boxes around me, right? It was a storage room, but they had no space for me at Acor. So they're like, we'll just put you in here for now, right? All you're doing is phone calls. And, I didn't know what time of day it was. It was like Vegas in there, like no time of day, the whole thing. And I just had my desktop in front of me, and a screen, a big flashy screen, right? Anyway, he gave me a list of 100 people and he said, these are the people you call to sell a booth to, but hey, I don't want you to talk about sales. Call them and learn about renewables so that you know exactly how to formulate your pitch. And so he gave me my first Rolodex and I called those 100 people. And as you say, he said, hey, talk to them about renewables, learn more about them. And at the end, mention, hey, we're doing this event. We'd like their participation. Can I follow up with you at a later time? Number two, ask them for 3 additional contacts they recommend I speak to. And that list of 100 then became 300, right? And then from that 300, it became 6 and then 900 and you name it. And that was really the best gift Mike Eckhart could have ever given me in my industry, was that first Rolodex of 100. Because now when I looked at my LinkedIn, I'm getting close to 17,000 contacts, right? Just organically that I've reached out to, that I've known and interacted with in this industry. And to think that 20 years ago, that list was 100. And today it's 17,000, 18,000, right? It's just really humbling. And it shows you 2 things, right? Shows you what a good boss does, which is a good boss is there to help you start your career and get you introduced to the right people. They'll get you to where you want to go with your career. And number 2, it's that advice that you remember the rest of your life. And so I still do it with new folks, and the call with, hey, who are 3 people you recommend I talk to, either within your organization or working on a project, folks that we might want to include in a project. And it always results in me meeting 3 more people out of that one initial call with that one person. So it's good advice. And the book is littered, I would say, with, or not littered, but the book has a lot of those kinds of pieces of advice, those pearls of wisdom, as we call them, right? That were given to me as I advanced my career, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really helpful advice. It's interesting because I think we connected a few years ago. I'm trying to remember who introduced us. And then at the end of the call, we did a Zoom call and you asked me, hey, are there 3 people?
Yeah.
And then it's interesting. That focuses me on really thinking of who would be helpful to you. And then you as well said, hey, here are 3 people I think based on our conversation that I think might be helpful. So it was interesting because not a lot of people do that. And I was told by someone to do that. And every time I've done it, it's actually been helpful.
Oh, 100%. And we're in a fantastic industry, Benoy, that everyone wants to help each other, even competitors. I might be competing with you developing a solar project, but there's so much opportunity and we all need to come together. I mean, that's a big part of the message here is with the book is, hey, there's so much business, so much opportunity here in the US. Let's come together as an industry. Let's celebrate all the milestones we've made today, but let's work together, right? And I have to say, I've never been in an industry where people really earnestly want to help each other out. And I think when you give those 3 contacts, it's not necessarily to help one party out, but it's also for you to say, okay, how can I help these other 3 people who might be looking for financing, right? Or who might be going through trouble on the ground level with their local communities, trying to figure out who can I work with to get past a permitting or siting issue, right? So it is that sense of helping each other. I think that also something that's special to renewables and to this renewables industry. And those introductions actually help us all. So
yeah, definitely. I appreciate you talking about that in the book. And then just obviously going outside of the book today, I mean, obviously there's a lot of great lessons and things are constantly changing within the solar industry or the solar roller coaster. Can you talk about like what trends you're seeing in the solar industry?
100%. As you all know, we just came out of an election cycle with, I think, 50% population knowing where it was going, 50% just being utterly surprised or disappointed, right? Listen, I think if I have a crystal ball here, I don't think the IRA, for example, will be completely repealed. I don't think so. I think there'll be what I call surgical focuses on certain aspects of the IRA that I think will be targeted. But when you look factually at the states that benefited the most from the IRA, especially with the renewables components of the IRA, Republican governor states won big time. And I think those Republican governors will be very adamant with the administration to let them know, do not touch these certain aspects, right? Especially these renewables portions of the IRA that contributed to workforce development, to greater interconnection of carbon neutral technologies, and you name it. So I'm not all doom and gloom about this. I think there's an opportunity here. For those of us also that worked with the Trump administration, interacting with them in this last incarnation, there were actually times, honestly, where interacting with a Trump White House got us further from a business perspective than with the Biden White House, right? I felt at times with the Biden White House, things just took a while. Versus with the Trump administration, if you had a pro-business message that showed the economics, that showed the investment figures, I felt you got some quicker pickup, right, from the CQ and other aspects of the White House. So based on that, and from my interactions with friends of mine that are lobbyists on both the Republican and Democrat side, there is promise, I think, that as long as we as the renewables industry talk about being an industry of pro-business, of workforce development opportunities, strengthening the transmission, right? Focusing on things that are going to help all of the above, especially the transmission grid, right? And modernizing that, I think we actually have a chance here to do some good. And the book goes into those roller coaster days. I mean, this is nothing new for us. We've been through the pitfalls, the ITC, PTCs, the 1-year extensions, the 2-year extensions, right? I remember once the ITC or PTC was supposed to expire at midnight, right? And the day of, we had no clue. And then they extended it for another year. So for those of us who have been on this journey for a long time, this is nothing new. I think we will fare through this. I think the most important thing to remember, especially for young people coming into this going, I'm a little uncertain at this point, given the results of the election. Listen, all the people in my book started in the 80s and the 90s in this. They're still with us working renewables. So that should be a good indicator to you that if you stick in it, you'll win in this, right? And we all will win. And we'll get through this, as we will with every administration. And it does come down to states, right? It does come down to permitting, citing, FERC, the importance of FERC, as well as the RTOs and regulatory bodies in the states. And I have great faith in decentralized policy here in the US and moving forward with that. So I think that's looking at trends from a policy perspective. I see that. From a finance perspective, the banks are behind this and they're moving forward, right? I don't think there's an issue of capital, the cost of capital, right? Obviously, transferability and tax credits will remain a big focus moving forward, and tax equity and the role of tax equity in deals. But I feel like the finance stars where it needs to be aligned. On the technology side, I'm so impressed. I feel a domestic manufacturing will get us to where we need to be, right? So seeing First Solar and Q Cells, right, announcing their plants and expansion of their plants in Ohio and Georgia and states that need the work, I think is fantastic. We hear about storage development and our counterparts in other foreign countries now setting up and establishing shop in the US. I think that's a great success story for all of us, right, as we start to develop storage. And listen, it's also about our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. I think with the new administration in Mexico, we have an opportunity to expand renewables in Mexico, which inherently helps us here in the United States. Same thing in Canada, expansion of renewables into Alberta, right, and west into British Columbia now. So it started out in Ontario with wind and solar in 2013, I want to say, right? That's when Ontario had a feed-in tariff and it went crazy. Well, we now see that movement now transpire across all provinces of Canada. So I think for the North American story, and I look at it more the North American narrative here, I think we're going into a good, solid decade of opportunity, right? And I think the thing, though, to watch out for are the tariffs and the tariff wars and the cost of materials. Because before domestic manufacturing comes online, we have another good 3 to 5 years until full supply chain here domestically is up and going. It's called the Band-Aid period. What do we do? How do we as a US industry win out during this Band-Aid period? So it is thinking through how will this Trump administration affect tariff policies and how will that affect pricing of renewables moving forward? Because there's just so many times you can go back to an off-taker and say, hey, I have to rewrite a PPA contract because of supplies going up in price, right? So figuring all that out. Unfortunately, I don't have that crystal ball. I wish I did, but I don't. But I'm hoping that a lot of these tariffs are more bluff moves to position us into policies that are favorable towards the US. And I'm banking that these are going to be more moves, hopefully knocking on wood here, that these are more bluffs than not. And we end up in a situation more positive to importing what we need right now as we ramp up domestic supply to meet 100% demand here in the United States and North America in general.
Yeah, definitely. Those are so many great trends and getting your perspective on the presidential election. And I think what's amazing too, what you mentioned is we're still very early in the energy transition and the adoption of solar, and as storage goes down in price as well. So obviously there are a lot of young people listening to the podcast, and it's still very early and there's so much growth still yet to happen. I know we've been in the industry and you have been in the industry longer than I have, and it feels like it's an extremely mature industry, but it's actually growing so quickly and exponentially.
It almost feels like we're at the beginning again, right? And there's an invaluable lesson for those listening who want to join. There's so many career paths. When you and I started in renewables, right? I wish there were so many career paths identified. And originally, I remember in marketing, there were no marketing jobs in renewables. I knew none. And to be able to say now that I'm not the only marketer in renewables is a great thing, and I'm joined by so many amazing marketers in the industry. I'm thinking of Kirsten Kirsch and Nick Santera and Jake Eady, Missy Schaaf, Aaron Greason. There are just so many great marketers out there in renewables. And to be able to have a community of professionals in renewables, specifically that deal with what you deal with day in, day out, is just such a great support system. And I think that's an important thing for anyone coming in. Know that from day one, you're going to have that support system. And I think that's what we do really well in renewables, is creating these support systems that help us not only grow as professionals, but also as individuals who are dedicated to a common mission and dedicated to that mission. So that's something that going to renewables, just be eyes open, that you're not signing up for a 9-to-5 job. You're signing up for a mission, as Bill Holmberg would say, right? You're signing up for a mission. And listen, if you're a good person, and I believe in karma, if you're a good person, you'll get reincarnated in many roles here in renewables. And you're really signing up for a lifetime of not only career success, but also personal joy and feeling of accomplishment and impact.
Definitely. That's a great way to end the interview. And you talk about that actually in the book. Most of the people in renewables are passion driven. They want obviously a cleaner environment, more renewable energy. And it's a different industry, obviously, and an industry that you have to constantly be adjusting to, right? Because things are changing so quickly, and we've seen so many small and large companies come and go. So it's being adaptable and adding value and being ahead of the curve.
And being open to pivot, right? I think one of the lessons I learned from the book and from these careers of these leaders, right? Usually you mark career advancement by going forward, right? And continuously going forward and advancing your career, right? And what people don't realize is advancement also comes in the form of pivoting. It doesn't mean that you're not moving ahead. You're just pivoting left and right. There's still momentum. There's still, if you're talking about it from a physics perspective, there's still momentum. There's still action going on. And you should not see pivoting left or right as somehow going backwards or taking 5 steps back. You're actually still proceeding forward in your career, but you sometimes have to pivot, and that's totally fine. And you should be okay with that. And I think that was one of the lessons that Nancy Floyd, who I cover in one of the chapters, speaks to. She's like, no path is linear. No job is linear. You have to be okay with pivot. And as long as you're okay with pivoting, you're good to go. You're advancing, you're still progressing on your career and your journey. So that's something I had to learn myself. And it's one of those life lessons that you take with you on your career. So I think, not to steal from Pivot Energy, but be able to pivot, right? Pivot left or right, and be sure that by pivoting, you're still advancing your career, still moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that also goes into another point of the book about accepting failure, which is the pivot, right? And then you learn from failure, and failure is a great teacher, right? On how to adapt and pivot, which I appreciated. You talked about as well in the book. So
Definitely. And failure, it begets success, right? And you need to fail. And don't feel like you only fail in the beginning. You fail many times during your career, even when you're advanced in your career. So it's a good lesson for all of us, no matter what phase of career you're in. Listen, you're going to fail. And the most important thing is to learn the lessons from that failure, not repeat it, and take those lessons and make them into a success story. That's the challenge, and that's the opportunity coming out of failure.
definitely. Well, this has been an amazing interview Tom, I appreciate you making time. And if our audience wanted to learn more about you or your book, what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, listen, as I mentioned with LinkedIn, you're more than welcome to add me on LinkedIn. I'm under Tom Weirich. You can't miss me there. And then also my book, We Took the Risk, actually has its own website. Believe it or not, wetookthe.risk.com was available when I went to trademark the book. And so wetookthe.risk.com is the book website where you can read more about the book. Obviously, it's on sale on Amazon, in your local bookstores. It is nationalized, meaning that you can go into any bookstore and order it. So go to your local bookstores. I'm a big fan of supporting local bookstores. Every local bookstore can order it for you, or out of necessity, obviously, Amazon and Rakuten and all the websites out there, the major book selling websites have the book. So I invite you to join me on the journey and enjoy the book. And of course, very much welcome everyone's insights and feedback on the book.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have that on the notes of the podcast as well. I really enjoyed the book, Tom. Thank you again for writing. I think it's helpful to all of us in the industry, and keep up the great work that you're doing for EDPR. And thank you again for your time today on this.
Well, thanks, Benoy. Keep on being the Maverick, right? And all of you on the call, keep on being a Maverick, keep on taking the risk. We all need to take the risk in order to really honor the potential of this industry, right? And so take the risk. We all are young at heart. We might be also young in body and physically young, but take the risk, keep on taking the risk, get the most out of your career, and let's all together work together for this common cause of making the renewable energy industry strong here in the US.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. And thank you again, Tom. This has been an amazing interview.
Great. Thanks, Benoy.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.